In this final video, we'll review briefly some of the criticisms and objections that have been raised to Clausewitz, because with Clausewitz's prominence, he of course has also attracted many critics. And we will have the opportunity to discuss this further in a live session, but we can for now review some of the objections that have been raised to his thinking. One of the arguments that's raised is the idea that Clausewitz has an excessive reliance on force. Remember that he emphasizes the role of the decisive battle. Argues that it's very important for armies to seek exchanges in which they can decisively destroy the enemy's army. Now, it's true actually that Clausewitz later on in his writing began to become more conscious of the role of limited war, including of guerrilla wars, of what he called in his language small wars, in which there's a profound asymmetry between the sides and where decisive battles are unlikely because the weaker side cannot attain a decisive battle, and the weaker side will therefore also seek to avoid a decisive battle. So Clausewitz was not blind to the fact that not all wars necessarily follow the course of interstate wars or decisive battles. But nonetheless, it's certainly true that one of the versions of Clausewitz, there are many versions of Clausewitz that have come to become prominent and popular. One of the dominant versions of Clausewitz has been this idea, certainly in the first half of the 20th century, that decisive battles was the main objective in war. Now, whatever be that as it may, what's certainly true is that Clausewitz tends to downplay non-material aspects of war. So whether he thinks a decisive battle is necessary or not, he certainly thinks that military exchanges is really what war is inherently about, and he repeatedly thinks that some of the non-material aspects, so the role of deception, of intelligence, of surprise, are negligible. He, for instance, writes very clearly that he doesn't think that surprise at war is very useful. Because of his suspicion and his lack of faith in in reliable information, he doesn't think intelligence also plays a major role. Now, this contrasts markedly with perhaps the only figure to rival Clausewitz as a philosopher of war, which is the figure of Sun Tzu, who precedes Clausewitz by perhaps 1500 years or so, closer to 2000. And one of the things Sun Tzu is a figure whose existence is difficult to ascertain. He may be composite, that's to say that he may never have existed. His writings may have been collective. We don't have a lot of evidence, but what we do have is a book called The Art of War. And this book has maintained a great influence in China and has continued and has now gained a much wider readership across the world. Now, one of the things that Sun Tzu is famous for is for stating that the acme of skill, the pinnacle of skill, is not to fight. That if you can defeat your enemy without fighting, then you have truly triumphed. This contrasts, of course, with this image we have of Clausewitz. So what Sun Tzu explains is that what we need to do, what the military leader should do, is attack the enemy's plans, is disrupt alliances, and that actual war is the last resort. So in this sense, the use of military force is only one of the possibilities in war and not its essence. Similarly, Sun Tzu puts a lot of emphasis on trickery and deception. In fact, goes so far as to say all warfare is based on deception. That what a military commander should always be doing is trying to deceive his enemy, is to do the opposite of what the enemy expects. If the enemy expects us to attack from the west, we should attack from the east. We should induce the enemy into believing that we are retreating when in fact we are about to counterattack, and so forth. Now, what that means is that under Sun Tzu's conception, the ideas of war and peace are blurred. It's not clear ever, really, within Sun Tzu when we are outside war, because every maneuver short of military conflict, of actual battle, can be conceived as part of war. So the idea of conflict here is a much more permanent one in which war and peace blur into one another. This is quite distinct from Clausewitz's understanding, because Clausewitz thinks that there are moments in peace and war, that war is initiated through political calculation and then leads to a resolution, perhaps through the decisive battle. And there's certainly an argument to say that this conception is much less pertinent to contemporary conflict than Sun Tzu is. But after all, we live in an age where war and peace appear to be quite markedly blurred. Think, for instance, about the war on terror, where we're never clear how the war on terror, where the war on terror starts and ends, and how the war on terror might even come to a conclusion. It certainly doesn't have many decisive battles. Or we might think about what's been referred to as hybrid war, or asymmetric forms of influence operations, for example, as conducted putatively by the Chinese and the Russians, where various maneuvers, hacking, intervention in elections and so forth can be understood as a form of war, even though they don't rely on conventional military force. Now this of course leads to a broader criticism of Clausewitz, which is that Clausewitz's ideas are time and place specific, so that actually while Clausewitz makes the claim and makes the important claim that war is a condition of historical circumstances and political conditions, his work does not escape a certain Eurocentrism, which is to say that he really ends up describing war in the context in which he experienced it. So for example, a historian like Keegan would make the point that war as a continuation of policy, famous quote by Clausewitz, really implies the state interests and calculations. And that a ready objection to that is that war predates the state, that we can have wars without states. So therefore, Clausewitz, from this point of view, would be outdated. Here, we find this argument replicated as well in the work of Martin van Creveld, that war, effectively, as Clausewitz described it, this Trinitarian war waged by states, or led by states, waged by people through the means of armies, is in fact a very historically specific idea of war, and that contemporary war is increasingly non-Trinitarian. So Van Creveld argues that in the late 20th century, early 21st century, what we see are wars being fought by guerrillas, by terrorists, by bandits, by warlords. We no longer see necessarily states. We no longer see conventional armies. Now, I think that this conception rests on a particular reading of the Trinity and goes back to a point that I made earlier on, which is to say, depending on whether we read the Trinity through the primary lens of its abstract concepts or through the secondary lens of specific entities that Clausewitz refers to, then we will get a different understanding of how pertinent the Trinity is. Van Creveld and Keegan and other critics who attack the Trinitarian conception typically engage the secondary Trinity. They say there are no states in these wars, therefore Clausewitz can't tell us anything about them. However, if we think about the primary Trinity, we could say, well, there might not be a state here, but there is an organization that is thinking rationally about the use of force. So I think this is an important distinction to bear in mind when we try to assess the Trinitarian or non-Trinitarian character of wars today. One objection that's also raised against Clausewitz is that Clausewitz has too little to say about the economic and logistical dimensions of war, that he generally assumes them and focuses on the battlefield preeminently. I think that's broadly a fair criticism. We don't find much about the economic and logistical dimensions of war, and it's certainly true that over the course of the 20th century, these dimensions have played an ever greater role. To increasingly extent, militaries are composed of complex logistical infrastructures. Wars are based on economic resources. And Clausewitz, again, has not so much to say about those, although it's not clear that he could have said all that much about them, given or much that would have stood the test of time, given how much of this has changed. But it's certainly true that, again, the emphasis on the battlefield that we find strongly emphasized on war is something that might not necessarily hold up in contemporary times, or at least one that has to be supplemented by a wider consideration of the tools and the supports of war. Finally, in a similar vein, critics have objected that Clausewitz says little about the role of technology, and therefore that various technological developments have outdated and perhaps rendered Clausewitz irrelevant. Now, of course, Clausewitz lived at the time of the pre-industrial revolution, or at least when it was just beginning, and hadn't really had much of an impact on war itself. So, of course, Clausewitz could not have foreseen many of the important technological developments that would follow. He couldn't have predicted, for instance, nuclear weapons, or computers, or drones, and so forth. If he had written much about technology in his time, most of what he would have written about it would probably be of little interest today, and indeed outdated. The more important question, really, rather than holding Clausewitz to account for not being able to prophesize the future, is whether the claims that Clausewitz makes about the nature of war might be made irrelevant by weapons. I've already, in a sense, touched on to whether nuclear weapons in some ways might challenge key Clausewitzian conceptions. There's certainly a difficulty in reconciling weapons of annihilatory destructive power with the idea that war needs to accord means and goals, that you need a clear political objective, and you need a proportionate use of military force in order to attain it. As nuclear weapons appeared in the middle of the 20th century, many reasoned that these weapons could not be used for any rational purposes. How can you use nuclear weapons, certainly in a full-blown thermonuclear war? What possible aims that you want to achieve, limited aims that you want to achieve, could be achieved by starting a thermonuclear war? Again, something that we can think about further when we return to nuclear weapons. But finally, we can think about the role of information technology, because this is a major claim of the last few decades, that we live in an age of a revolution in military affairs, whereby information technology, computers, sensors, artificial intelligences, and so forth are transforming war, are giving new understandings and new visibility, transparency to the battlefield. So, for instance, claims have been made, as William Omans, for instance, here in this quote, that technology has lifted the fog of war, that the old constraints on knowledge that Clausewitz thought he saw in war might no longer be pertinent, that now battlefields can be seen on a 24-hour basis, in light and day. If you want to see what's behind a hill, you send a drone to fly over to see it, or you use up-to-date satellite imagery, and so forth. And it's clear much has changed in ways that Clausewitz could barely have anticipated. But we should also be wary of some of the hype behind the idea of the revolution in military affairs. Because what information technology produces is information, is data. But is that information always what it appears? Do the same quandaries, dilemmas not resurface? How do we know which information is to be trusted? Particularly when adversaries might seek to induce us in illusions, when deception is employed, when adversaries send purposefully misleading information to us to deceive us, when they penetrate our computer systems and inject, again, misleading, misguiding data within it. It's not clear that we've escaped from the dilemma that Clausewitz identified, that we have to always be able to distinguish good from false information, and that there may not be always a clear objective basis on which to do that.